go through what I've done, because I think this last lecture Belinda titled Catch Up or Survey or Run Through or something was wonderful. And so that's in some sense precisely what I'm going to do. But I also want to highlight a number of issues that I've referred to in passing numerous times, so I'll just refer to them again. I mean, one of the things, just to be slightly anecdotal, if not autobiographical, one of the things that marked the move from the 80s to the 90s to where we are now was the way in which philosophy figured within architecture. Shall I just grab the door? At a certain moment in the 80s and in the 90s, people read work by Derrida, by Foucault, by Deleuze, by a whole group of absolutely seminal and important philosophers. And in architecture schools and in art schools, people sort of asked, what do we do with this work? And that, to my mind, was a very interesting question. Because the question asked what that is external to architecture, philosophy, theory, how does that come to be made internal to architecture? And that question of the movement from one discursive practice called philosophy to another discursive practice called architecture, discursive practice understood in broad sense, was never thought through, and hence the problem of what I referred to one of the lectures as the literal emerged. People did things that were literally folded, literally deconstructed, literally this, literally that. And so what was lost was a sort of supple way of thinking about theory. And at a certain moment, the aporias, or the paths that went nowhere in philosophy's relationship to architecture, gave rise to almost the abandoning of architectural theory and the move of the major theorists to writing history, which is a perfectly acceptable pastime amongst consenting adults. But what was lost was the possibility of thinking the practice of architectural theory. Now, in the first lecture, what I gave you was something I've, someone who works in architectural theory, this is the autobiographical element, I often ask myself, what do I do? Like, what is architectural theory? Is it sort of simply reflecting on architecture? And it seems to me more and more that the answer to that question is to engage with the issues that arise from the practice of design. Now, once design is given a history, so that it's not simply the same old thing, once design is given a material presence, namely it uses pens and paper, then it uses compasses and drawing instruments, then it uses computers, then it uses modeling systems, etc., etc. Once the process of design is given this extra element, then a whole series of questions arise, such as what is a line? How do we think about lines? How are lines used when we draw on the board? How are lines used when they all of a sudden become a spline? What's the difference between one sort of geometry and another? And these questions, whilst abstract, are inextricably bound up with issues that arise from design. And it seems to me that that's where the force of architectural theory has to be located, in thinking about those issues, not in terms of utility, not in terms of dictating what architectural designers should do, but in terms of thinking theoretically about the issues that arise when designers work, or when design takes place, or when things such as volumes or diagrams, whatever, appear, the questions of how to judge them, how to understand them, become the province of architectural theory. And I suppose one of the things I've tried to develop throughout these lectures is to take certain philosophical positions, certain historical positions, and say, well, right, let's not, worry about this guy being fashionable and this person not, and this being read and this not. Let's try and situate it in relation to the practice of design and what is design. Now, that would be, if that's all that was involved, it would be easy, no problem. However, there is a fundamental historical dimension to all of this, namely that design has a history. It's the first point. Secondly, that design has conditions of possibility. And those conditions of possibility are not that the designer moves his or her hand or fingers flitting across a keyboard or anything like that. The conditions of possibility have to do, and this is where my first lecture opened, with a theory of the now in which we write, the now in which we design, the now in which we think about the past. Now, in philosophical terms, I've always written about this or thought about this as having a theory of the present. Not the present that's sort of 10 past 5 or 20 past 5 on whatever date it is in 2004. Not that present, but the present in which we operate. Because that way of thinking about the present generates, there's a way of thinking about the present that generates certain things that are only possible within it. A way of thinking about the place in which we undertake activities, where the place of those activities is the now in which we are found. Now, therefore, the first lecture I gave, and to put it boldly, was trying to think about the now in which we write, the now in which we design, the now in which we judge, the now in which we operate. And that now operates, again in painting in very broad brushstrokes, between a theory of modernity and a theory of globalization, or the global. It's very clear that money runs around the world through and pays no attention to geographical boundaries, nation states. It's clear that with the internet, information and knowledge run rounds the world without any need for nation states. With MSN Messenger, I can establish little groups that I can talk to that are either here in one particular temporal period or in another temporal period that has no way of dealing with nation states, with peoples, with boundaries. In other words, there is in every level a theory of the global. There's no escape from it, even if one wanted to escape from it. That being the case, there's also, and this is especially true in this context, there is such a thing as a theory of modernity. There is such a thing as the modern, that is different from such a thing as the not modern, or the past. Moreover, the modern has its own understanding of the past. So that the situation in which we operate is we have to think about the global and globalization. But the globalization involves a series of different parameters and permutations with different understandings. For some people, globalization is wonderful. For some other people, it's a complete nightmare. I mean, international bankers think it's wonderful. The no-logo people think it's dreadful. What both of them agree on is that it's inevitable, and it's there. There's no escape from it. But that needs to be situated within what I would want to think of as a theory of modernity. Why would one think of a theory of modernity? The reason for thinking of a theory of modernity is this. I mean, the simple answer is to say, because it's true. Like, why is it whatever day it is, Tuesday? Well, it is, it's true. But that's not going to work as an answer. Once we think about the theory of modernity, what we privilege is innovation and change. That's what we privilege. And hence we have to worry about fashion, that notion of change in which nothing changes. But if we think about innovation and we think about change, we think about the movement of historical time in terms of radical discontinuities rather than simple continuities, then when we think in those terms, it's inevitable that we think about the nature of this moment as being discontinuous with another. This moment called modernity. So the first lecture I gave, I started by talking about, and it was slightly apocalyptic, but I nonetheless think it's true, the pamphlet written in 1828 by Heinrich Hubsch, In welchem Stil sollen wir bauen? In what style ought we to build? And I tried to argue that the moment you can ask the question of how to go on. How do we go on? In what style ought we to build? The moment you can ask that question, there is a severance. There is an interruption. The moment it's no longer given how to go on, but we have to go on, given that inevitability, the moment the question can be asked, what we're left with is the insistent presence of a break. Now, because interruptions and breaks can always be effaced, because they're delicate, they're fragile, we can refuse them by saying, oh no, it's just the same old thing. What I want to do is be absolutely attentive to difference and not attentive to identities. So the differences between, in the first lecture I talked about Winckelmann and Hupsch, the differences between them, minor in terms like one sentence versus another, announce an absolutely fundamental shift in how the question of design, how the question of how to do architecture is posed. When Hupsch asks the question, in what style ought we to build, even though, as I said, he generates his own answer to that question, there's an opening. And I describe that, and I'm sure there are many other better ways of describing it, but I described it as the severance of style and appearance. Now, it's that for architecture, and indeed for art, it's the severance of style and appearance that marks the advent of the modern. It's very interesting. I think I mentioned, because of my preoccupations and interest in art, I mentioned that another way of thinking this whole thing through could be to think of it in terms of Manet, the great French painter. I mean, the absolute centrality of Manet's refusal of perspective. If you look at the execution of the Emperor Maximilian, all you can see is the refusal of perspectival space. But it's not as though it's abstract. It doesn't to refuse perspectival space is not to move into abstraction. Manet's work forces us to think in other ways. And I think I quoted Bataille's interpretation, which I think is completely correct in this instance, of Manet's Olympia, where he argues that she's neither prostitute nor goddess. So she's neither the god, the goddess as one version of femininity, or the whore as the other version of femininity. She's located beyond that opposition. And therefore, as Bataille says, she exists nulle part, nowhere. And in that existing nowhere, an opening is created. It is the same, as it were, the same opening that you could argue that's created when Hupsch asks his question, in what style ought we to build, because there is no ready one identifiable answer. So these projects, and there are many others in my opinion, where you can begin to find these absolute points of interruption, these caesuras in how we think and how we think about the presentation of images. So if we are attentive to the question of the modern, and a question of the nature of modernity as a notion of historical time, not as style or design, but the notion of historical time as a rupture, then we become attentive to its consequences. And the consequence, for the sake of regards to art and architecture, are very simply the severance of style and appearance. And hence, that's what I tried to argue, the nature of architecture as an appearance, like what is it that makes the modern, now it becomes a question. But because it's, as I said also, that these things are bound up with means and modes of representation and can't be thought except in relation to them, then equally that allows us to think about how the severance of style and appearance works in relation to the images of architecture, the images that we see as presentations of architecture. So this should work. Wow. No, I wanted Borromini. Now, where is dear old Borromini? Maybe he's not. There's David. There's Borromini. Badum. There we go. My favorite slide. Okay. Now, the reason why this is my favorite slide is this. This slide dramatizes the distinction between architectural history and architectural theory. I mean, just bottom line. Architectural, I've got the pointer. Architectural history is concerned with the relation, quite rightly, with the relationship between the circles, the ellipse, and the equilateral triangles as generative of this line. And when Steinberg and others, Blunt and others write about this line, they write about it as generated by these internal geometries. And that's what gives borrowing its power. When I write about it, or when I think about it, what interests me is the way this dense line here, what that line could produce. Not how the line is produced, but what it could produce. And the move to ask of a line what it could produce is to allow this line to be productive. So we're not interested in its meaning. There's nothing wrong with identifying its meaning, but we're not interested in its meaning. We're interested in its productive potential. And that productive potential is that this dense line carries wall, column, vaults, etc., with it. That line then becomes productive. Now, this is not to say for a moment that it's Baroque or not Baroque in Deleuzean sense. That both matters and doesn't matter. It depends the level of Oedipal fidelity one feels to Deleuze, and that's up to you. What interests me about it, and where Deleuze is absolutely right, is that we can see this line as operational. In other words, we can see it as a productive line. However, this is, I think, the next part. Once you want to argue that it's productive, then what you're arguing at the same time is that it's not representational. Once it's productive, then if you were to use a line as a dense line that carried the elements of architecture and information with it, then you wouldn't see it as representational, but you'd ask, what is it productive? What does it produce? And that opens up the theory of the diagram. Now, lots of people have written about diagrams, but they can be quite genuine, quite simply formulated as this. It's a line that carries the potential for representation, but is itself not representational. So it's not that it's non-representational. That would be to misunderstand it. It's productive of representations. Now that becomes, therefore, a moment of decontextualizing this line, and gives us a way then of thinking about lines as productive. Now, there's a lot more, and I've said it many times, so I'm not going to repeat it, about why I think that this gives then a way of understanding lines as opening up possibilities. Now, in the context of the lectures, what I tried to do was situate Borromini in relation to Ledoux. And I did this for a very specific reason, that the first one or two lectures, I know they seem like years ago, but they were only last week, they do seem like years ago, was to situate Kaufmann in relation to Rowe. And I did that because of my belief that history is best understood in terms of radical discontinuities. What interested me with Kaufmann was that, whether he's right or not, the detail in some senses we can argue and debate this, but what is interesting about Kaufmann is his absolute insistence on the discontinuity, on why it is that the move from the Baroque to Ledoux, say 18th century, marks a fundamental shift in how space is organized, and thus how lines are thought, how lines are understood. Now, the interesting thing, and I've said this to someone, is that the interesting thing about discontinuities is that we can then understand why pivotal figures who are there at the edge become interesting. I mean, anyone who's done any carpentry knows that you discover the middle point of a piece of wood not by measuring from the middle, but by measuring from the edge. You always start at the edge. The edge will tell you something about the middle. What's interesting then historically is to find those architects, and Isaac Ware in the British context is a very interesting one who, as you know, is the one who first translates Palladio, and Ware is this fascinating figure. Kaufmann writes of Ware as someone who's neither Baroque nor classical, but operates always on the edge, and his work can be read as hovering at that particular moment. So while he's not that interesting globally, he's absolutely fascinating because he's the edge architect historically. But anyway, my interest in Kaufmann is that he insists on discontinuities. He insists on radical interruptions. Now, I'll come back to the limits of that, but just to show you, remind you of the images. Well, they're probably going to be further forward. Here we go. Right. That this was the Ledoux image. This is the salt works at Show. This is the salt works. This is the village that he then constructs. And what I tried to argue in relation to Show is that what you see here, this is a much better image, is what you see here is architecture's conception of autonomy. You see the autonomy of the blocks, and if you go back to the very first slide, which I won't, you see the autonomy on the level of the plan. You also see autonomy in relationship between nature and the city. There are layer after layer of autonomy. We are really clever because we don't live in the 18th century, and as I said at the time, we can see this line as connecting these two and maybe undoing that sense of autonomy. Kaufmann wouldn't do it. Ledoux wouldn't have. He would have seen it as connecting two autonomous realms. So this line is singular in the 18th century. We're sophisticated, we can read it as doubled, as complex, as dense, but it was a single line that joined two autonomous realms. Now, I said at the time, and I still think there's something to it, that bless you, I think that Kaufmann is right to see that what he identified as the Baroque Concatenation, that wonderful word, ends with this. In other words, that if you're talking about the history of lines, that the move from this as a concatenation, this concatenates all the elements. This, even though it's a plan, a city plan, not just simply a line, this individuates all the elements. So you can see the choice here, and it's a stark one, to use Cartmans Language, between the Baroque concatenation and the 18th century autonomous block. And now, historically, this is interesting. For us, I think it's just as interesting, because what it means is that it gives you a way of understanding that when you draw a point and connect it and draw another point and connect those, that sort of drawing of a line between points or through points, whatever, these have histories. And the history of the concatenated line is fundamentally different from the history of the autonomous line, the line that joins these two autonomous realms. In the 18th century, in architectural terms, except as a place of procession, you'd never think about this line as anything else than that which separated two autonomous realms. You'd never think concatenation. Now, my interest in Kaufmann was the fact that he saw this as a fundamental interruption. Now, I'll get to the limit in a moment, because I want to sort of run this past Colin Rowe. You know, the other person who is of interest to me, and hopefully maybe of interest to you, was Colin Rowe. Not because, he's inherently interesting or intrinsically interesting or he's true or anything like that. It's because that what he does is say, hold on, as it were, it's not as easy as you think. The move from Palladio away to the modern is far more complex than simply positing a break, simply positing modernism's idea that it was self-sufficient. And what he argued, as I tried to show you, was that both Palladio and the Corps of Gauche, both Palladio and Mies of the 50s, were driven by the notion of the centrality of the block. In other words, that the desired move and this radical break didn't occur because what was retained was the effective centrality of the block. And if that's true, I'll leave this as a question, if that's true, what it means, of course, is that modernism's belief that it had broken with Palladio is false. Thereby, if we accepted Rowe's argument, dramatizing once again the question, what is modern architecture? Because from Rowe's position, something like a Palladio appears modern. And so at that particular moment, we can see that Kaufmann's insistence on interruption and radical breaks and writing history about the history of breaks, And Rowe's notion of continuity, of the retention of ideal geometries, the retention of blocks, looks like, and indeed they are, two diametrically different ways of thinking architectural history. Now, that, if you're an architectural historian, that's very interesting, because all of a sudden you've got to make a decision. Are you with Rowe or are you with Kaufmann, or is some version of one or the other? So there's a fundamental shift in, a choice rather, in what you've been given. Now, what I then tried to do, because it's my nature, I wanted to complicate this by saying, sure, absolutely, no problem. However, this is true on the level of the plan. It's true that when Colin Rowe redraws Garches and redraws Palladio, he can redraw Garches showing that the golden section is there in the elevations. He can redraw it to show that the centrality of the block marks the plans of both late Mies and Palladio. However, if you take the plan, the elevation and the plan to be part of the same mode of representation, the argument is true on the level of the plan. In other words, the argument is true on given a certain form of representation. And the question I left posed then was that, is it as true, or is it true for different reasons, or is it false for different reasons, if we altered the modes of representation? If we asked not what am I looking at in terms of a plan, but, for example, if I asked what am I looking at in terms of what materials make possible. So that while Rowe discusses the H-frame and discusses the difference between that and what he identifies as the German column, nonetheless, what emerges is an analysis driven by the plan. And what I then posed as a question is, what happens when you think about the history of architecture not driven by the plan, but driven by the way in which materials work, driven by the idea of material possibilities? And I suppose in one sense I left that question there, though I took it up, as I'll indicate. But to recap, two things emerged. I'd like to think at least two things emerged from the early lectures. One was to note not simply that architecture is bound up with modes of representation, but certain arguments about architectural history are constrained by one mode of representation as opposed to another. And that therefore a way of interrupting the hold of architectural history would be to refuse to see this as generated by these internal geometries, but to see these lines as productive. Equally, to upset the, as I mean to use a wonderful Derridian term, the deconstruction of the 18th century would begin to work on this line. Because this line is the radical separation of nature and the city, so they are posited as autonomous realms connected by this neutral line. And if you think about, if you actually look at 18th century taxonomy drawings, if you look at Buffon, Linnaeus, the way in which the 18th century draws itself as all separate elements, what's always left out is any discussion of the lines that connect the separate elements. And we know that individuation within a genus is far more complex than simply the radical separation of elements. So the analysis, or the so-called deconstruction of the 18th century, would begin to show in what sense this line is not that of complete radical separation. If we did that, we would no longer be reading this representationally. We'd be taking this not simply as mapping a certain historical configuration, but equally, if we followed this deconstructive line, mapping the impossibility of that separation, whilst at the same time showing that separation. In other words, it would be a map, because it is a map on some level, that demands a far more complex understanding than complete separation. In other words, we'd come to look at it in a different way. Having talked a lot about Rowe and Kaufmann, about lines and about maps and about drawing and understanding representation, What I then moved on to do was to really raise the question of materials. And what I wanted to try and argue then, and it's a project, an ongoing project for me, so it was the first attempt to present it to you, was really to allow the idea that the history of architecture could be the history of material possibilities, and not simply the history of plans and the history of drawing and the history of lines. Though that's absolutely bound up with it, it could be the history of material possibilities. And so what one would begin to look at in both this sort of drawing and even the drawing of Borromini is the way in which what is being presented as much as a line is a material possibility. Now, what I then wanted to do, and I believe it's fundamentally important, would be to construct almost a historical series of connections that allowed that sort of position to be presented. And what I did, I think, a number of times was referred to, I think, a fundamental distinction, which is there, I think I mentioned it last night, it's there in the work of a very important art historian called Riegel, who develops the notion, as I said last night, of Kunstwollen, which is the will to art where the idea is always external to the object, as opposed to a concern with a materialist account of architecture. And a materialist account of architecture is not one that gives you a historical theory of materialism, or a materialist theory in the Marxist sense, though that's not precluded, but that's not the argument. It's actually to begin to think about the way in which matter works. Now, one of the fundamental ways that we can begin to understand this is, bizarrely, I said this last night, to look at 19th century German thought's relationship to the Greeks. And, you think, oh, why do I need to do that? I have to read, I have to think. Why would I need to do that? Well, precisely because what the Germans and certain French saw in Greek thought was matter at work. It wasn't an idea exemplified in matter, it was matter at work. And that's when I read you that bit, which I think is outrageous, but I think it's wonderful as well, from Zemper, where he says that art in its highest exaltation hates exegesis. And so should we. We shouldn't be interested, we shouldn't reduce architecture to its symbolic meaning, to its symbolic presence. We shouldn't be concerned merely with meaning. We should be concerned with how that meaning is created by the operation of materials. In other words, what becomes interesting is that interplay. And then if you look at the canonical historical text, someone like Gideon's work on iron and cement, and you think, well, how could you write a book as boring as on iron and cement? Well, you can, because it's fundamental to the operation of architecture, is that it operates through the use of iron and cement. If you forgot that, then you wouldn't be understanding how something works as architecture. You'd be simply interested in how an image portrays a series of meanings. There's nothing wrong with images portraying meanings, because that's what they do. But equally, what is being imaged is a series of material possibilities. And that, to me, as I said over the last 2 or 3 days, makes something like the work of Gottfried Zemper absolutely fundamental. Because it was Zemper who, as I said, not simply privileges the tectonics or privileges structure, but undoes the opposition between ornament and structure. And that's why what emerges as fundamental is something like textile. And I told you about my jumper last night. Because jumpers are pullovers, what are they called? Sweaters. I forget which is the Australian, which is the English now. I think Australians say jumpers, and English say sweaters, I can never remember. Anyway, one of these things. Where what becomes interesting about this architecturally is the fact that this line here, which is discontinuous, 2 separate elements, comes to be continuous, and the force of the material, the force here, my hand pulling it, that can be transferred through materials across a discontinuous line. So there's something interesting, not simply in materials, but in differing materials, and the way differing materials work. So a materialist account becomes one that's concerned with the potential within materials. And part of what I took up when I looked at the work of Zemper and then Knox last night was to try and take that a stage further. Which I'll do now. I won't go through the whole Plečnik thing. I couldn't. I'll come back to Plečnik. I'll leave you with a Ledoux thing. What I tried to do when I looked at the work last night and the night before was to say that there is actually a way of beginning to think about materials as a site of investigation. Now, the reason why we would do that is the following. I think in the practice of design, one can draw a distinction between, or I would want to draw a distinction between volumetric ways of thinking about the organization of space and programmatic ways of thinking about the organization of space. And then to see how these things are thought together. And the intertext, or one of the buildings I use constantly to make this point, which I'll do for the last time, is Loos's Villa Müller. The importance of it to me, apart from the fact that it's such a historically interesting building, the importance of it for me is that you cannot separate program, function, and program, geometry, and materials. They are inter-articulated, and hence they form what I called a material event. Now, why is that true? Well, if you think about the way in which it's a house, the way circulation works within it, the way it distinguishes between a sedentary, a seating, an ambulatory, a walking subject, the way it distinguishes between the genders, the way it distinguishes between the domestics and the people who live there, the way it distinguishes between the children and the father and the mother, etc., etc. All that could be done in the 18th century by simply saying, well, they go there, they go there, they go there. In other words, it would be there on the plan. I mean, just forget that these are gardens. For the moment, it could be, well, mum's there, dad's there, the children there, etc. You'd see that level of compartmentalization that was never layered or dense or held together. Plus, you wouldn't really worry too much about how it was brought about materially, except that these would be solid walls and you'd hide the mother there, the father there, etc., etc. Now, what makes Loos so interesting is that all of these things are captured by things that you know as well as I, by the round plan, working with cladding, the Bekleidung. And it's the relationship between the cladding, what's on the wall, the so-called wall, and the volumes that enables the differing subject positions to be established. So it's not the wall as the load-bearing entity. We know from Zemper that that's not what a wall is. That's just the solid thing behind it. The wall is that which creates the space, because there is no space. It's created. Therefore, the cladding here, cutting the volumes cutting the cladding, enable movement and enable the distribution of programmed space where one program area of program space is separate from another. These things cannot be thought as other than interarticulated. It's very tempting to say, though I won't, as concatenated. Not that that makes them Baroque, but it shows that with the material event, if you'll accept this formulation for a moment, what cannot be distinguished are these elements. Therefore, the diagram, the abstract machine that generates Loos, is that these three elements cannot be separated one from the other. That it's that which enables the building to work as architecture. That's where it is to be located in that particular state of affairs. You cannot separate one from the other. You cannot give an account, therefore, or at least obviously you can. You cannot give an adequate account of what Loos is doing unless you refer to the operation of materials. You would misunderstand what he was doing. You cannot give an account of Loos if you don't recognize that it's not simply a domestic house, but a domestic house structured around circulation paths, and therefore involving different subject positions. You cannot give an account of Loos unless you recognize that the geometries are constructed such that the facade is both visually and programmatically indifferent from the interior space, the inside wall, so it's a hard element carrying two different surfaces that are, whilst simultaneous, are also distinct, because they're structurally, they're indifferent to each other, both visually and also potentially programmatically. Now, all of these things cohere. There is no this and that and that. They're all interarticulated together. And it seems to me at that particular point, one can begin to say, all right, here is the beginning. I mean, other people have done it as well, obviously. Here is the beginning to tell a story about the operation of architecture that does not privilege meaning, though clearly there is meaning. We could understand the way the domestic is structured, we could understand the way gender relations are constructed by the building, but we wouldn't just say, oh, there it is, as though it's simply a description. We would have to say that if it weren't for the cladding, it wouldn't work that way. If it weren't for the realm plan, it wouldn't work that way. If it weren't for the surfaces, it wouldn't work that way. In other words, it is the architectural resolution of certain notion of the domestic, but realized architecturally. So it's not a concern with simply being a historical object, it is the architectural resolution to a certain way of understanding the domestic. Therefore, if the domestic was something one would be interested in, one would always be interested in both its history, because it has a history, but how it then is realized architecturally, not in terms of attributing certain activities to area spaces, but to show how the actual architecture, and that would be as discussion as much to do with programs as it would of materials, makes that possible. And to do that, one would be privileging, rightly or wrongly, one would be privileging what I call, rightly or wrongly, the material event, and beginning, as I said, to write the history of architecture in terms of that event. Now, in order to take that a stage further, because it looks, I mean, I thought it looks both clunky, mechanistic, and too easy. In order to take that a stage further, what I did was look at the work of the Dutch firm Knox. Now, I'm not going to show you the slides again, though they are pretty good. The reason why I privilege that particular type of work necessitates me going back slightly. It goes back to the way in which I want to, on the one hand, think about productive lines. That the absolute value of Deleuze lies in the many reasons why his work is valuable, lies in the idea, that opening sentence of that chapter from Le Pli called What is the Baroque, that says the Baroque is an operative function. To think of it as operational gives us a whole other way of thinking about lines. But in order to avoid an idealist account of the operation of lines, we need to recognize the role of matter. We need to recognize that it's not simply the operation of lines. The other element I isolated in Deleuze, where I thought there was at least some point of equivocation, was he quite rightly says that if you think about it on the level of philosophy, that the fold must unfold to infinity. That's what Leibniz means when he says there are an infinite number of folds in the soul. I tried to give further evidence for that when I took up Deleuze's distinction between his celebration rather of Rauschenberg and Pollock as it were Baroque painters. And I tried to give you the reason why we can note that distinction is that if we look at classical painting, if we look at the painting of the 17th century, or equally, when you actually do it here if you want, you know, this gives you the, I mean, let's call this a painting, for argument's sake. Let's say, for argument's sake, and this need not be true, but let's just assume it's true because you're nice and I'm tired, is that that's the focal point, okay? That's the focal point. So you walked into the gallery, you sit down, and bang, your eye goes straight there. The very fact that the eye goes straight there means that this is a painting, it's not art. The eye goes straight there, therefore the eye now can flip out to here, and to here, and to here, and then it can flip back. Then it can plot relations, but it plots them because of the centrality of that point. Now, that need not be true about that, but that doesn't matter. That's the way perspective works in painting. It falls to one point and flips out. That's also, parenthetically, what makes Manet's painting of the execution of Maximilian so shocking, because of the way it defies all the expectations of perspective. That's a second story. Given the the expectations. The reason why Deleuze is interesting on Pollock was that there is no point of departure that gives you relationality, where an individual point individuates another, and then you swing round, etc., etc., etc. What becomes interesting is that the moment you isolate one point in a Pollock painting and draw every other line in relation to that, that is as exact, because it is exact, as highlighting any other point. In other words, that the infinite series of related points of relation within a Pollock painting are there visually, but equally, if we were thinking of it architecturally, we'd notice that you have the finite series of relations have as their condition of possibility an infinite. And that's where it begins to tie up with the Baroque. So if we're talking about painting, this becomes an adequate description. If we're talking about Leibniz and the infinite number of folds in the soul, it becomes an adequate description. The question is this true architecturally? And the answer I was suggesting is that it's not true architecturally. What architecture has to do is make something stand up. In other words, there has to be a moment at which the infinite is given material presence. And at that particular point, what architecture has to think is the relation between immateriality as a potential and materiality as necessary for architecture. And what then becomes interesting is that we then have ways of working out what is the movement to finitude within architectural possibilities. And at that point, what I wanted to do is to insist upon this distinction between the immaterial and the material. In the same way as that the line on the Pollock painting is one line, you start there and just draw a series of connections. It's material, but it brings with it a realm of immaterial possibilities. They're as it were, they have a potential there to be drawn, to be mapped out. What's interesting then is to say, all right, what happens with architecture when we need to make a decision that leads to materiality? The reason why I highlighted the Knox process was that I was interested in the stages of development. Now, in discussion, very interesting discussion with some of you last night in the bar, you kept saying, why did he start with movement? And I kept saying, well, you've got to start somewhere. And I think there's a more serious answer. I mean, just again, a story. One of the things I enjoy doing enormously is supervising PhD students, and they invariably come up with the one problem, which is how do you start? Like, how do you write the first sentence? To which the answer is it's easy, you just start with the second sentence. The point is that you have to start somewhere. What Knox do in taking the body and filming the body and then digitizing that movement, why that becomes interesting. Now, and I don't think that this is even argued for in their own literature, is that it takes architecture's fascination with the body as a generative device, but no longer idealizes the body as a site of symmetry and proportion, which is a body that, bless us, no one has, but says, all right, there's another way of thinking about the body's relation to architecture, and that is to take movement within space, because that's what you do when you move, and your body, as it were, spaces, of generating the initial diagram. In other words, that you start not with the body as external to architecture, but to take movement within space, which is what architecture allows you to do. It allows us to move in space as generative of a point of departure. Now, that's not arbitrary. In fact, it's deeply historical. It's doing what architecture has always done, namely situating itself in relation to the body. But instead of doing the Albertian move of seeing the body as external, a mythic body as a site of proportion and symmetry, flipped into architecture, it says, no, we're already moving. Let's take that movement and generate an abstract diagram from it. What became interesting to me then in that project was that addresses the point of departure. It's historically traditional, we use the body. It's radical in that it uses the body in a way that is not that architectural history had not expected it to be used. And that gives you something that is parenthetically, I think, very interesting, that architecture is always bound up with the body, but architecture changes, so does architecture's conception of the body change. So the body for architecture has a history that runs from Alberti through cyberspace through to movement as being what bodies do. Given that, what then becomes interesting is the way in which you move from the body as the registration of movement to develop what Knox takes from Frei Otto as an analog computer. Now, I talked a lot about that last night, but I'm just going to say one more brief thing about it, because I want to make it absolutely clear what goes on. If you just indulge me, I'll just run through the... This will take 2 seconds. It's getting tired. Okay. What becomes interesting then is the way in which they took the models, they took the computer registration of the movement and then generated strips of paper that carried that information. Now, the reason why, the one point I wanted to make, is that the reason why this becomes interesting at this end was if you have all of these strips of paper and you bring them down to a point, you bring them, but then they layer over each other, and all you can do is stick a pin through that point to bring them together. But the paper allows the arabesque to emerge. It allows for the opening up here so that you get a space frame and a space frame with an opening. It allows that arabesque, these arabesques to emerge, to flip around here, to interconnect, to create the vaults. But the paper can't resolve certain problems, which is how you get the endpoint. So what's interesting is that this becomes possible by using a paper model, which is then digitized. You find that the limitations of the paper are overcome by the digitalization, which then allows you to make this endpoint, which you then build in steel. In other words, this becomes almost a one-to-one diagram for the steel, but therefore, is it representational? Is it a scale model? What I tried to suggest last night, and this goes back at some point to where I started, it depends how you read. What I was trying to suggest is that these space frames, while steel, are equally splines that are lofted across. In other words, what we see when we look at that is no longer an image that is simply a representation. It's bound up with its conditions of possibility, namely a certain use of modeling software. And that gives it its strength. So therefore the mode of investigation to develop this sort of architecture works through differing layers of abstraction, material models, and finally types of representations. But the importance of it is that materials are not interesting simply because architecture is built out of materials. Materials are not interesting because there can be smart materials and dumb materials or anything like that. Materials are interesting for the reason that Zemper was interested in materials. Namely, they have the quality of textiles. They have a tectonic in them. And that tectonic can't be generalized the way Frampton and others generalize tectonics. Tectonics has to do with the relationship between material and geometry. Therefore, you can't essentialize them. My fascination with my own clothing has to do with it's inherently, this clothing is interesting because it captures a relationship between geometry and materials. It's there in the weave. It's there in the way things operate. So materials, therefore, have to be used as sites of investigation. They can't be simply, well, we build out of materials, let's develop this sort of materials, porous things we can walk through, walls that do this. None of that is interesting, though it is important to develop smart materials and sustainable materials and materials that will allow for environmental concerns quite rightly to be articulated within architecture. All of that is absolutely central. What I'm talking about is something slightly different, I like to think related but slightly different, and that is what you do when you do architectural research. And one of them is to do research by thinking of materials as occasioning possibilities. Now that's interesting to me at least, is that that's exactly what happens in the German style debate. So it's as though what we've forgotten, I mean, how many of you remember the old German style debate, but what we've forgotten about it is it was not a debate about style qua style. It was not a debate about the separation of style and appearance, though it was that. It was the recognition that once there is a radical separation of style and appearance, then what we then do is no longer think about the projective, meaningful nature of the object, though objects have a meaning, it goes without saying. If you then read what Bertischer in the 1840s and all of them begin to argue after that, is that the reason why we're interested in the Greeks is because of what they did with stone. The reason why we can't do what the Greeks did is why would we do in iron what we can do in stone? A new material generates new possibilities. We need therefore to understand that the generation of these materials has new possibilities, and to think that way. Now, as I said, that's the clunky mechanistic view of it. I think what is released as a potential at the same time is the capacity to think of materials not as that out of which you build, that's true by definition, but as sites of research and investigation. In other words, to see materials not as scale models of buildings, though clearly they can be, but to see materials the way that in that line I tried to draw from Zemper through to Frei Otto, the way that tradition is going to think of materials, namely in terms of their inherent tectonic potential, which is a relationship between material and geometry. Not to fetishize it, but to work out why is it that it's interesting. I mean, the story I told you last night about Sutton House and about these screens, let me just repeat it because I feel I told it badly, but it's such an interesting moment. Sutton House was a 16th century house constructed in Britain. It had on the front door these extraordinary screens, and the screens operated by a notion of permeability. But they're these intricate, within the screen, there's this intricately cut series of wood, parts of wood that weave backwards and forwards. It's all one piece of wood that is this incredible weave. And it's thick, it's dense. It covers about 1.5 to 2 inches if you move from the inside to the outside. Now what's interesting, as I said, is it lets in light, but also creates privacy. It has these emblems on the front, so the emblems hold the eye, so it gives you automatically the eye stops, so the eye has to move past that to see through it. It's also elegant and beautiful. It's also a magnificent use of wood, done in the 16th century, so we're not going to do it again now. But what my interest in it is that it's precisely that would have excited Zemper, were he to have seen it. He would have said, aha, got it in one. No longer a distinction between structure and decoration. No longer a distinction between structure, decoration, and function. This screen functions to complicate the relationship between the private and the public. How does it do that? Not by telling you that it does it. It does it through the way in which the wood operates with the carving, as carved. Equally, it's decorative. But the decoration is not there stuck on the surface as though you have edifice, then decoration. The way in which it functions as decorative, its use of materials, is all one and the same. In other words, it's the textile that is operative. It's the tectonic that is operative, but we're bringing all these three things together. Now, this is just one moment. There are many other moments, there are millions that one could identify. But I wanted to make a lot of it because this is not necessarily something that's absolutely modern, that is only done now. Indeed, if you go back, you can begin to see how there are moments of what I'm calling the material event that operate in the history of architecture. One can begin to identify them and then make a lot, as I'm trying to, make a lot of them. So therefore, materials are interesting because of their potential, because of the way in which they become sites of experimentation. If you took, as it were, the diagram of the Sutton House, these openings, what you would then, if you took the diagram, what you'd end up with is precisely not this, but a way of understanding the lineage of this, or moving from this back to that. Namely, it's an operation of materials, and that would generate something. Finally, there is no end to this, but I'll bring it to an end in a moment, because if there are questions, I would like to take them. The whole argument then is an argument about materials. It's an argument about how we begin to judge and evaluate contemporary architecture. What I've tried to do is give you, from my position, which is up to you to do with as you wish, a series of concepts and categories that would enable that to take place. But I would like to think, I would say slightly pompously, that it's not simply speculative, like, well, hey, this is what I thought about this morning. I mean, by continually going back to moments of history, especially the beginning of 1828, the German style debate, is to try and situate this absolutely within an understanding of architectural history as conventionally construed. But then to reread that moment of 19th century history, going to the 20th century, in a way that, not that anyone, I'm sure other people do it just as well, probably better, but to read it as a debate that in the end insists that we talk about architecture in terms of material possibilities, because that's what they discovered. Now, that's what we tended to forget that when we analysed the debate, and we thought it was just about style and just about appearance. But what they insisted on was that appearance, which is what these lectures are called, I think, that appearance is bound up with the appearance of materials. So it's not an image. It's not, the world is not constructed through Photoshop. It may come as a complete surprise, but it's not. Those images exist within Photoshop. They're not images of the world. More importantly, they're not images of material. They are images. And what we should do with images, ask, as I said in the very first lecture, or second lecture, what are you inviting me to look at? You're not inviting me to look at the image of what is it an image. This is an image of the way Maya works. This is an image of the way in which steel operates. This is an image of the way in which space frames articulated together, when generated in certain ways, will yield openings. This is not, this is an image, etc., etc., etc. There are many things of which this is the image. So when we begin to look at this, this is not an image that illustrates something. This is an image to show you the way materials are produced through material diagrams, and the way materials then work in the creation of architecture. So fundamental to what I'm arguing is almost, and I say this with almost type of reluctance, is almost a residual iconoclasm. Namely, I think we should be enormously suspicious of the world as created through Photoshop. Not that there's anything wrong with those if we do calendars or do advertisements, then it's absolutely the way it should be. But we should be very tentative in our immediate assumption that the image, the bright glossy image that we see on the screen, is architecture. The reason I like this one so much is that it's black and white, it looks like a wireframe, it's not very attractive, etc., etc., etc. And actually it's full of a whole series of possibilities that we should think about in terms of what architecture is doing now, and not in terms of a series of, as I said, images that show us nothing about architecture, because they're images that resist absolutely the operation of material possibilities. Final point, therefore, I mean, to the extent that, and there's no reason why you should, but to the extent that one accepted what I'm calling the material event, this relationship between geometry, materials, and program, as defining architecture, as giving you a way of thinking about architecture in terms of judgment, creation, etc., 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 then the question emerges, what is the image of a material event? Not the image of this or that, but what is the image of a material event? And it seems to me that when you then do your work, whether as designers or historians or theoreticians or whatever, then what becomes very interesting to ask is, of what is this the image? Or if I want to privilege materials, then I don't show Colin Rowe's images, because Colin Rowe's images are images of plans and elevations. They're images that not reduce in any dramatic sense, that identify architecture with the history of the plan, with the history of the elevation. That's what that image is an image of. So deployed in his writings, that's what architecture becomes. If we didn't believe that, just for a nanosecond, if we didn't believe that and thought that it was actually the history of material possibilities and not the history of plans and sections, though clearly plans and sections play a role, but if architecture is the history of material possibilities, what's the image of that? What is the appearance of that? And that, to my mind, is the question of the problem of modern architecture. Because of the looseness with the image, the fact that we're very sophisticated, we can see everything and everything, all things in one image. How is it that this opening up that gives you materials, that forces them upon us, because that's there in the debate, that makes us think about adequation in relation to materials used properly, because that's there in the debate, how does that then be shown, not in terms of a discursive argument of my reading you something, but by showing you a series of images? And it seems to me that what becomes very interesting, therefore, is not, I joked about iconoclasm, is not to be iconoclastic and sort of to want to get rid of the image, but as I think I said in the very first lecture, what is the image of modern architecture? And that necessitates thinking about the relationship between image and material as productive. Right, well, I'll stop there. And though I would say that I said I'll stop at 6:15. There's another lecture at 7 o'clock, which I'm asked to invite you to come to, and I'm not exactly sure who's giving it, but I'm told it's very good. Do you have I know lots of you come to ask me questions afterwards, but is there any general question you'd like to ask? Yes.
What is the weak point of Notch project?
Big voice?
The weak point of this project?
You mean other than the aesthetic one that it looks horrible? Okay. What I argued, that's a very good question. What I argued is that in the end I said this was a singular building. And I meant that in a very precise sense. It was, what I meant by the singular is something that resists prototyping, something that resists ubiquity, the Gehry ubiquity as decoration, prototyping as the Nike model, giving you the model for architecture. It's singular because this is a specific understanding of the way in which geometry, function, and materials operate to give it to you. I think its limitation is that on the one hand it may not be radical enough in the way in which it deals with the relationship between the floor and the wall. Equally, its limitation is that it's bound up with a specific art event, namely it's a place where you go through, and as you walk through you pass sensors which go to a computer, which then begin to score music, and you hear that. So to the extent that it's an art event, an architectural realization of an art event, that would be not its weakness, because I don't want that word for the moment. That gives you its limitation. Now, everything has a limitation. Goes without saying. Its limitation is that it becomes the site of an art event. And to that extent, you know, the thing about art events is that they have a greater exhaustibility than a conventional building, which doesn't have such an exhaustibility. There's a certain moment, imagine even in the greatest painting, at a certain moment you'd think, well, I've looked at it enough. I'll look at it in 10 years' time. You know, we even could be bored of Manet at a certain moment, or Pollock, or whoever at a certain moment, and think, oh, tomorrow. Now, the trouble with architecture when it's an art event is that it has that sort of problem. So that's its limit. Now, I'm a positive person, therefore I want to talk about its strength. Its strength lies in its singularity. That would be my answer. Are there other questions? Yeah.
Do you think it's more of an installation in architecture?
Well, I think that the question is whether its relationship to being an installation and architecture. I think on one level, sure, it is an installation. On another level, no, it's not an installation at all. An installation is far more ephemeral than this is. This is far more architectural. An installation is often installed in something. This is not installed in anything. It will set up relations. I mean, it's in a site of other buildings. It will set up relations between these other buildings in a way that an actual installation would not. So I think it has specificity. Are you stretching or asking a question? Yeah.
Yes. How conscientious was the designer's decision in that project? I mean, was it a process they were consciously pursued, or?
I think that I mean I only know this because I sort of have worked with the architect who did this. I think that the thing about using the computers the way it was done was to generate analog computer models to see what will happen. And the creation of the arabesque, to go back, but I don't have models of the paper one. The creation of the arabesques with using paper as an analog computer model, it was you couldn't determine exactly what was going to happen, and the manipulations of them literally manually by hand. And here there's a great link to the way Jesse Reiser uses material models and lots of other people. Manipulation of them by hand is both unpredictable in terms of what's going to emerge, but equally there are levels of prediction. But it's always an oscillation between the two. So it's never completely conscious. Sorry, it's never completely intentional, but equally it's never completely unintentional. And I think that I mean it's very interesting. Is that I mean to give you a very sort of an interesting example from literature. It's a very interesting French writer, sadly no longer with us, called Georges Perec. One of the things he did was he wrote a book without the letter E in it, which whether you write in French or English is no mean feat. But why is that architecturally interesting? It's architecturally interesting because here's a constraint. The constraint is the absence of the letter E. It doesn't follow from that, accepting that constraint, that you know what sort of book you're going to get. Equally, the power of the book, its function as literature, doesn't reside in the fact that no, there isn't a word that contains the letter E. It still has to be a good novel, otherwise it just becomes an uninteresting experiment. I make that point because clearly a constraint has been set. The constraint is the digitization of human movement and the transferring of that human movement to the creation of a analog computer model. That's the constraint. Now, given that, what then happens has to stand on its own. It's not explicable nor justifiable nor whatever in terms of its narrative of construction. I've insisted on telling you the narrative of construction, and therefore we wouldn't judge it in terms of that narrative, we'd judge it in terms of something else. I insist on telling you the story of the narrative of construction precisely because what it dramatizes is the way in which materials can be sites of experimentation, sites in which we can find something out, some way in which things can be used by looking at intrinsic properties of materials, not in terms of how well they'll be adapted for building, but what they show you in terms of generating vaults and lines and columns, etc., etc., etc. So, all of those elements indicate that once a constraint is accepted, something becomes possible. The acceptance of a constraint is absolutely intentional. It doesn't follow from that everything else is predictable in terms of that acceptance. Are there other questions? Yeah.
I'm curious about your sense that maybe looking at material as a sort of a historical perspective.
Mm.
Maybe that's not really quite the way you want to phrase it, but that maybe radicalism is stretching material to sort of maybe a catastrophic event within the material.
Mm-hmm.
Would that as a type of radicalism as opposed to just formal use of the material?
Well, I'm not. I think that I'm not quite sure what you're asking. I mean, I understand what you've said. I'm not quite sure what's going on behind the question.
Well, I guess the way I'm trying to phrase it, the question is, I don't see where the radicalism happens, or the innovation
Well, that's interesting. I mean, it does seem to me that on one level, I don't want to. I mean, in fact, I say this in something I wrote. That I think actually that the work being done by engineers on materials, work being done by inventors, in scientists, whatever, in thinking about how materials can operate, how they can be reconfigured. For example, the university I used to teach at in Britain is the main centre for the development of the aircraft wing, and the new generation of aircraft wings will be made out of plastic, but they have to develop a plastic that is lighter and harder than steel. And when I say it's plastic, you think I'd never fly again. But in other words, that there is incredible innovation on the level of developing a material that will enable this to happen. And I'm, because I'm being a sucker for this sort of thing, I think it's great. However, the question is, why is it architecturally interesting? Now, I'm not asking you to answer that question, but I think the question that we'd have to say is, what is architecturally interesting about the history of material innovation thought as simply material innovation? That's the first point. Now, it's not inherently architecturally interesting. Let's make it architecturally interesting. That would be one domain of activity. The other domain, and this is my own commitment to the initial experiments of Frei Otto and others, is that what does interest me is that what they were looking at was incredibly focused. Like, what happens when I take wool between X and Y, take that distance, add 10%, so it's that distance plus 10%. I dip it in water and I pull it out of water and stretch it, and I watch the fibres begin to stick and make volumes. And then I dip it in wax and show in what sense I've got some sort of vaulting emerging where the weight would be transferred from the vaults right down through. In other words, that you're discovering something about the creation of volumes and the insertion of volumes that has to do with the way in which wool operates as a material. And we would begin to discover not simply the return of the Gothic or anything like that necessarily, but we'd begin to discover in what sense wool functions when wet and operated in this way as a site of experimentation. We'd then say, all right, now, why is that architecturally interesting? Well, it shows you in what sense, with a certain force applied to this material, you get sticking and opening, and it's not it's all the fibres are continuous, and yet they're generating discrete openings and volumes, etc., etc., etc. You're discovering something that you didn't know before that's inherent in the material itself. So that's the second domain of investigation. Now, it seems to me absolutely fundamental that these two domains be interarticulated, that the inventions of new materials by scientists, by researchers in industries outside of architecture, it's incumbent upon architects to ask, well, how could that be made architecturally interesting? That's why collaboration with architects and Ovarup and this and that become incredibly important to see what is happening and what potential it has, to see when an architect says, how do I do that? An engineer might say, well, we've just invented this, and that might do it. However, I'm wanting that to be true, and I've never precluded its importance, but equally, I want to say, but hold on, if you not go back like to the good old days, but if you think about it, we can actually begin to look at the potentials within materials and see what those potentials tell us. Now, in order to do that, we can't have, I would argue, a direct transfer from what's discovered in material X to its built form, nor should we see what's discovered in one material as generating a scale model or be directly transferable or anything like that. We have to think of the notion of the analog computer versus, as it were, the digital computer. And that's why the digitalizing of the analog becomes something very interesting. And it seems to me, at that particular point, one can begin to identify it's not materials in and of themselves, but their qualities and what they generate. And then the question is, how do I make that architecturally relevant? How does something that's true about, your iron filings and whatever it is, become architecturally interesting? It does through a series of transformations. Otherwise, all that's interesting is the image that's created. And there's nothing wrong with that as a realm of investigation and a realm of practice, and it's fundamentally important. But what's important also is to say, well, rather than see the produced image as what's architecturally interesting, it's actually the qualities I'm discovering of the way the materials operate prior to their digitalization that will force my research in one direction rather than another. So I'm sort of arguing, I guess, for an intermediary step in which one worries more about the quality of the textile than the image of the textile, I mean, to put it crudely. So I'm not precluding what you're saying for a second. I'm just wanting to see these things as slightly different. And I use words like radical very tentatively. People who went through 68 use the word radical. I shouldn't use it. I realise that. And I don't think it's radical. I just think what becomes interesting is ways of reconfiguring or reconceptualizing the history of architecture in terms of material possibilities. Yeah.
I think I have a question as to on which level I would need to understand the innovation you describe in the material event. I mean, is it such that it would enable us to step outside of the history of the present?
Oh, well, no. I don't think there's any. I think the whole point about that version is that you only ever find yourself outside it. I mean, the way history operates, I suspect, is that I don't think that Hoopsch had any idea. If my story about Hoopsch is right, if it is, I mean, I'm sure he had absolutely no idea that in putting a question mark at the end of the title of his pamphlet, that the possibility of that debate gets going, and with there what it means. I don't think that when Bertischer complains that people keep building stuff in iron that looks like stuff in stone, surely that's to misuse materials. The radical potential of that is that it frees materials up as a site of thought rather than what architecture represents and stands for. So I think that we only notice these things retrospectively. What I was trying to argue last night is that Kiesler and Zemper become interesting in this sense because of this, not because there's a linear narrative leading from Zemper through Kiesler to this. It's rather we see this and retrospectively create that story. So it's a standard Foucauldian argument, which I accept, that you write a history of the present. You don't write a history of linear narratives leading to the present. Now, therefore, what becomes interesting is how we think about the present, and that's where I started. Namely, we think about it on the one hand in terms of theory of globalization, others in terms of theories of modernity, but in architecture, theories of modernity are bound up with notions of material possibility. So it's never a question of standing outside the present, it's a question of recognizing, that notion of specificity. But what the present is going to generate, our present, is the possibility of singularity. And the singularity of this, and I talked also last night about Diller and Scafidio's I-Beam Museum, which I think is singular precisely because it's unrepeatable. And its unrepeatability is not simply that it's a one-off museum, it's the way in which, it takes, takes Rem's Kunsthalle, drives the two things together, but realizes that folded series of relations where two buildings are in one building. Rem separates them, he drives them together, they drive them together. The interarticulation of the two buildings is inconceivable outside of a certain series of material possibilities. And so that gives it its singularity. It can be repeated as a diagram. Namely, here is the way in which you use materials, geometries, and program to create something singular. So it's never a question of standing outside the present. That would only occur if one felt one could totalize something and move beyond it. I mean, that's not an option. Which means that criticality there is bound up with how program is thought, rather than simply in terms of instrumentality. No, that's my answer. Are there other questions? Okay. If not, I know I've repeated myself a little bit, but if you've heard it once, there's no reason why you can't hear it twice. So anyway, thank you very much for indulging these lectures, and I've enjoyed myself. you.